I want you to picture the kind of woman who can smile at you on a Monday morning, hand you a coffee, and spend the rest of the week quietly dismantling your reputation. She does it softly, gently, with a tilt of her head, and the right kind of sigh. She never raises her voice, never sends anything in an email that could be screenshot and forwarded. She is careful. She is calculated. And for almost 2 years, she was my direct manager at Cypress v. Holt Marketing Solutions in Denver, Colorado. Her name was Dana Mercer, and she was very, very good at what she did, which was making people like me disappear. My name is Tessa. I'm 31 years old. I have a degree in communications, 7 years of industry experience, and what I would describe as an unfortunate tendency to be good at my job. I say unfortunate because I've learned that being good at your job is not always the asset you think it is. Sometimes it makes you a threat. Sometimes it makes you a target. And sometimes, if you happen to be better at something than the person who is supposed to be above you, it makes you both at the same time. I joined Cypress v. Holt 2.5 years ago as a senior content strategist. It was a step up from my previous role, good salary, great client roster, and the kind of open plan office that looks impressive in recruitment videos. Dana was already there when I arrived. She was the head of content, my boss, and on my very first day, she welcomed me with a firm handshake and told me she had big plans for our team. I believed her. I had no reason not to. She was polished and confident and knew the names of every client off the top of her head. I went home that first evening genuinely excited. The first few months were fine. More than fine, actually. Dana seemed to like me. She praised my campaign briefs in team meetings, forwarded my reports to the director, Marcus Webb, with little notes attached that said things like, "Tessa's instincts are sharp and strong thinking from Tessa here." I felt seen. I felt valued. I was working 60-hour weeks because I wanted to, because I was building something. I didn't notice when it started to shift. That's the thing about a slow burn. You don't feel the heat until you're already in it. Looking back, I can pinpoint the moment things changed. It was a Thursday afternoon in November, about 5 months into my time there. Marcus had pulled Dana and me into a meeting with Callaway Brands, our biggest account at the time. The meeting had not been going well. The client was unhappy with the direction of a campaign. They were asking hard questions, and Dana was getting flustered, something I had never seen from her before. She kept circling back to points Shed already made, and the client, a sharp-eyed woman named Rita, was visibly losing patience. Without thinking, I stepped in. I didn't do it to undermine Dana. I genuinely just saw an opening and took it. I reframed the campaign angle on the spot, spoke to what Rita's actual concern was, and by the end of the meeting the client was nodding and taking notes. Marcus looked pleased. Rita shook my hand on the way out. Dana didn't say a word the entire drive back to the office. She was quiet for a week after that. Not cold, exactly. Just quiet. And when she did start speaking to me again, something had changed in the way she spoke. It was barely noticeable. A slight edge behind the warmth. A pause before she answered my questions that hadn't been there before. I told myself I was imagining it. I wasn't imagining it. It started small. In our weekly one-to-ones, Dana began raising concerns about my work. Not big concerns, not the kind you could argue with. Just small things, framed carefully. She'd say something like, "I just want to make sure you're managing your time effectively," when I had just delivered a full campaign deck 2 days ahead of deadline. She'd ask if I felt confident enough taking on certain clients, always with a little furrow of her brow that made it sound like genuine concern. She began CCing Marcus on emails where she gently flagged minor things I'd done, always with the caveat that she was sure it wasn't intentional, always making it sound like she was protecting me while simultaneously handing him a log of my supposed shortcomings. At the same time, she began taking credit for my work in ways that were hard to call out directly. She'd present a strategy I'd developed in a director meeting without mentioning my name. She'd forward my research to clients as her own thinking. Once, and this one still makes my jaw clench, she took a campaign concept I had pitched to her privately, slightly reworded it, and submitted it under her name as a recommendation to the board. Marcus praised it in an all-staff email. I sat at my desk and read that email 3 times. I didn't know whether to cry or scream, so I did neither. I just saved the email and kept going. I started documenting everything. I don't know what made me start. Maybe some quiet instinct that things were heading somewhere I didn't want to arrive at unprepared. I kept a running document on my personal laptop. Dates, times, what had been said or submitted or sent. I didn't tell anyone about it. I just kept it updated, quietly, the way you might keep a spare key somewhere you hope you'll never need. By month 8, the criticism had escalated. Dana started raising performance concerns in writing. She sent me a formal feedback email saying that several colleagues had expressed concern about my communication style and my tendency to go around the chain of command. I had no idea what that meant and asked her directly. She said she couldn't share specifics to protect the people who had spoken up. I asked Marcus if I could speak with him about it. He was perfectly pleasant but told me that if Dana had concerns, she was following the right process and that he trusted her judgment. I walked out of that conversation feeling like the ground had shifted 2 inches to the left and nobody else could feel it. The colleague situation was its own beast entirely. Dana had a tight inner circle, 3 women who had been with her since before I arrived, who went to lunch with her every day, who she championed for every internal opportunity. Their names were Becca, Lori, and Carla. They weren't bad people, individually. Becca was actually friendly to me in the early days. But Dana had a way of cementing loyalty that I didn't fully understand until later. She shared things, confidences, little pieces of information that made people feel special, chosen, trusted. And in return, they reflected her narrative back to her. If Dana said Tessa was difficult, Tessa was difficult. If Dana said Tessa overstepped, Tessa overstepped. They weren't lying exactly. They were just repeating what they'd been told because they trusted the source. I found out the extent of it from someone who wasn't in the circle. Her name was June and she worked in the accounts department and she had no reason to be kind to me, and yet she was. June found me in the kitchen one afternoon and, after checking that no one else was around, told me quietly that she had overheard something I should know about. She said she'd been passing by the small conference room on the 2nd floor and heard Dana talking to Becca and Lori. She hadn't heard everything, but she had heard Dana say, clearly, Tessa thinks she's going to Marcus directly, but I've already got that covered. He listens to me. He always has. She can make as much noise as she wants. Nobody up there is going to believe a word she says. I stood in that kitchen for a long time after June left. I thought about the past several months. I thought about Marcus' pleasant, dismissive expression when ID tried to raise concerns. I thought about the feedback email. I thought about my document. And I thought about what it felt like to know you are being systematically set up for failure by someone who smiles at you every morning and hands you a coffee. Then I went back to my desk, opened my document, added an entry for that day with the date, the time, and exactly what June had told me, and I kept going. The formal performance improvement plan landed 3 weeks later. It was 4 pages long and listed 8 areas of concern, all written in the careful corporate language that sounds reasonable on paper until you realize that almost none of it is based on anything real. My failure to collaborate effectively, my pattern of bypassing established communication channels, my inability to receive feedback constructively. Dana delivered it to me in a meeting with an HR representative named Carl, who looked uncomfortable the entire time and avoided my eyes whenever possible. I read through the PIP in the meeting without speaking. Dana talked through each point.
She was warm about it, compassionate even.
She kept using phrases like, "We want to support your growth, and this is about setting you up for success." When she was done, she asked if I had any questions. I looked up from the document. I looked at her. I said, "Yes, actually. I'd like a copy of the specific complaints or evidence that led to each of these points and the names of the colleagues who raised concerns so that I can respond to them properly." Dana blinked. Carl shifted in his seat. Dana said that wasn't how the process worked. I said I understood, thanked them for their time, and left the room. I went home that evening and did something I probably should have done months earlier. I called an employment lawyer. Her name was Sarah Flood, early 40s, no nonsense, with the kind of calm in her voice that makes you feel like everything might actually be okay. I spent an hour and a half on the phone with Sarah, and at the end of it she said 3 things that I will never forget. She said, "Document everything. Do not escalate internally without being prepared for them to close ranks, and do not resign. Whatever you do, do not resign." I had not been planning to resign, but hearing her say it made me realize that some part of me had been considering it just to make the daily grind of it stop. I put that part away. I was not going anywhere. Not on Donna's terms. The next 6 weeks were some of the hardest of my professional life. I was completing every task on the PIP to the letter, keeping records of everything I submitted, and when getting read receipts on emails where I could, copying myself on everything. At the same time, I was managing a full workload, keeping my composure in meetings where Dana would subtly undermine my contributions, and trying to act completely normal while building a case that I hoped I would never have to use. There was one afternoon, about 4 weeks in, where I sat in my car in the parking garage and just cried. Not loud, dramatic crying. Just the quiet kind, where you're so exhausted and so angry and so tired of pretending to be fine that eventually it has to come out somewhere. I gave myself 10 minutes. Then I fixed my mascara, went back inside, and submitted my weekly progress report to Dana at exactly 4:45 p.m., as required. What I didn't know, what none of us knew, was that Donna's behavior was not limited to me. Her name was Shauna. She was 26, a junior content coordinator, and she had been hired 6 months after me. I had always liked Shauna. She was creative and quick and had the particular kind of energy that makes open-plan offices bearable. She had also, as I discovered when she appeared in the doorway of the small conference room one Tuesday morning with her eyes red and a printout in her hand, been going through something very similar to what I had been going through. Just a faster, crueler version of it, because Shauna was younger and quieter, and Dana had perhaps assumed she would be easier to break. Shauna sat down across from me. She put the printout on the table. She said, "I need to tell you something, and I need you to know that I know this might go nowhere, and I'm scared." I told her to start from the beginning. It took 40 minutes. Shauna had been at the company for 18 months. In that time, she had watched her role quietly shrink. Projects she'd been assigned were reassigned without explanation. Her ideas were recycled by Dana in meetings as the team's thinking. She had been given feedback so vague it was impossible to act on. And then, 3 months ago, she had been handed a PIP of her own. She had not told anyone because she was embarrassed and because she had been told very clearly by Dana that it was confidential, and because, and this is the part that made something go cold in my chest, Dana had implied that if Shauna made a fuss about it, she would make sure Shauna couldn't get a reference anywhere in Denver. I looked at Shauna for a long time. Then I told her about my own PP. I watched her face change. I told her I was documenting. I told her about Sarah Flood. I asked if she'd been doing the same. She hadn't. I told her to start that afternoon. Then I said something I hadn't planned to say. "Shauna, do you have anything? Anything in writing? Even something small?" She pulled the printout toward her. She said it wasn't much. She said she'd found it by accident. She had been helping Dana with a laptop issue a few months back, updating a shared file, and had briefly seen Donna's personal email open in a browser tab while the file saved. She hadn't thought much of it at the time, but she'd seen a name in the subject line of one of the emails. Her own name. The subject line had read, Shauna situation, keeping it quiet. Shauna had not read the email. She'd looked away immediately. But the name in the to field had registered before she could stop it. It was Marcus Webb. Dana had been emailing Marcus directly, from her personal email, about Shauna. And based on what Shauna had described, it wasn't the kind of email that was going through the official HR system. I picked up my phone, and I called Sarah Flood. Sarah asked a very specific question. Had Dana ever sent anything from her work account that could be interpreted as personal in nature? Complaints about colleagues? Conversations that went beyond professional feedback? I thought about it. I told her about the times Dana had sent me feedback notes late at night, the ones that were oddly detailed, the ones that didn't read like formal HR documentation, they read like she was working something out on paper. The ones where she described me as overly ambitious, politically motivated, and once, in a message that I had saved with a particular sense of disbelief, the kind of woman who smiles while she stabs. Sarah said, "I want to see everything." I sent Sarah every document I had that evening. Shauna sent hers too. Sarah spent 4 days reviewing them. She came back to us on a Friday afternoon and told us she believed we had enough to file a formal complaint with HR that would be difficult to dismiss quietly, and that she recommended doing so with the specific request that all internal communications, including cross-platform and personal account messages, relating to either of us be reviewed by a neutral third party. She said this because she believed, based on the patterns we had described, that Dana had been conducting a significant amount of her coordination off the official systems, and that if she had, there was a chance those communications existed somewhere that could be surfaced. We filed on a Monday morning. Certified, documented, through Sarah. HR, specifically, a woman named Karen in the regional compliance office who had been brought in precisely because she was not local to our office, acknowledged receipt within 2 hours. By Wednesday, Dana had been placed on paid leave pending investigation. I will not pretend that the next 3 weeks were easy. The office was strange. People talked quietly. Becca stopped speaking to me entirely. Lori looked at me once in the kitchen with an expression I couldn't quite read. Not quite hostility, not quite sympathy, and then looked away. Carl from HR checked in with me twice, which felt performative, but I appreciated that someone was at least going through the motions. Marcus called me into his office and told me he was committed to a fair process. He was very calm about it. I was calmer. The investigation moved faster than these things usually do, and I think I know why. Dana had been careless. Not in her interactions with us. Those had been carefully managed, deliberately vague, plausibly deniable. Where she had been careless was in the communication she had assumed would never see the light of day. She had used a personal Gmail account to coordinate with Marcus about both Shauna and me. She had sent him detailed messages describing her strategy, and I used that word deliberately because that was the word used in the investigation summary, her strategy for managing us out of our roles. She had described me as a liability to the team dynamic and said she needed Marcus to stay aligned with her messaging so that any complaints I made would be handled consistently. She had described Shauna as too inexperienced to know what recourse she has and suggested that a quick PP followed by a quiet exit would be the cleanest outcome. There were 17 emails. Over 4 months. All from her personal account to his work one, which meant that his side of the correspondence had been sitting in the company's server the entire time, accessible to the compliance team the moment they were authorized to look. I found out about the content of those emails through Sarah, who was given a redacted summary as part of the investigation process. I did not read them directly, but Sarah read every word and told me that they painted an unambiguous picture, a deliberate, coordinated campaign to manage out 2 employees by using a PP process that had been decided in advance of any documented performance concerns. In one email, Dana had written, and Sarah quoted this to me directly, "The PIPs are just the paper trail. I've already made sure Marcus will back whatever conclusion we land on. The PIPs are just the paper trail." I sat with that sentence for a very long time. Marcus was not let go. He was issued a formal written warning, placed on a management development plan, and in a move that struck me as both inadequate and completely predictable, quietly moved to a different division. Dana was terminated. Not with a big announcement, not with any of the fanfare that usually surrounds departures at that level. One Thursday, she was on leave. The following Monday, there was a brief email from the CEO saying she had decided to pursue other opportunities. No mention of the investigation. No mention of Shauna. No mention of me. Shauna and I both received formal apologies. They were written on company letterhead, signed by someone in regional HR I had never met, and were careful not to admit anything that could be used in subsequent legal proceedings. Sarah reviewed mine and called it competent but not generous. She told me what I was likely entitled to in terms of a settlement and what a realistic negotiated outcome looked like. I won't give you the specific number because it's none of your business, and because the number was not, in the end, the point. The point was the sentence Dana had written. The PIPs are just the paper trail. Because she had been so confident that nobody would believe me. So confident that Marcus was in her corner. So confident that she had already controlled every variable and that I would simply tire myself out pushing against walls she had quietly built around me. And she had conducted herself with such certainty of her own untouchability that she had committed all of it, in detail, to writing, just in a place she thought no one would ever be allowed to look. She was wrong. Turns out the paper trail cuts both ways. Shauna left the company. She was offered an excellent package and took it, and the last I heard she was doing freelance work for a creative agency she actually likes. She sends me a voice note on my birthday every year, and I send one back. We don't talk about Dana, mostly. There isn't much to say. She was what she was, and she did what she did, and it's over. I stayed. Some people found that surprising. Even Sarah raised an eyebrow when I told her. But I had a reason, and the reason was simple. I was not going to let Donna's last act be the one that pushed me out the door. I had earned my place at Cypress v. Holt. I had done the work. I had built the client relationships and developed the strategies and stayed late on Fridays and come in early on Mondays, and I was not going to walk away from that because someone with more tenure and fewer scruples had decided she would rather destroy me than be outpaced by me. So I stayed. I asked for and received a formal reassignment of my reporting line because Marcus was still technically in the building during the transition period, and I was not going to sit in another one-on-one with him pretending things were normal. I was placed under the newly appointed interim head of content, a calm, methodical man named Pete, who to his enormous credit never once made me feel like I needed to apologize for still being there. Over the following months, things slowly recalibrated. Becca eventually came around, not effusively, not with any great acknowledgement of what had happened, but she stopped blanking me in the corridor, and one day she asked for my opinion on a headline, and we ended up in a 20-minute conversation about brand voice, and it almost felt like a normal working relationship. Lori transferred to the Chicago office 6 months later. Carla, to my genuine surprise, sent me a LinkedIn message about 4 months after the investigation closed, saying only that she was sorry she hadn't spoken up sooner, that she hadn't known the full picture, and that she hoped I was doing okay. I read it several times. I wrote back and said I appreciated her saying so. I meant it. The client I had saved that day in the Callaway Brands meeting, Rita, became, indirectly, part of what rebuilt my standing at the company. Because the work I had done on that account had continued to perform well, and by the time the dust settled from the investigation, the results were undeniable. A retention, a contract renewal, a referral to a sister company. Numbers don't have politics. Numbers don't have allegiances. Numbers just are what they are. And mine were good. Pete put me forward for a promotion 8 months after the investigation closed. I was made head of content.
Donna's old job.
I don't think of it that way most of the time, but sometimes I do. And when I do, I feel something I can only describe as a quiet satisfaction so deep it barely needs to announce itself. I think about what it took to get there. The documentation. The late nights, keeping records when I should have been resting. The phone call to Sarah when I still wasn't sure I had enough to do anything. The conversation with Shauna in the conference room with the door closed and her red eyes and the printout in her hand. The decision every single day to keep doing the work even when the work was being siphoned away from me. The 10 minutes crying in the parking garage, which I no longer feel any need to be embarrassed about because 10 minutes was all I gave it, and then I got back up. I think about June, too. The woman from accounts who stopped me in the kitchen with a piece of information she had no obligation to share, and every reason not to. I think about her a lot, actually. She's one of those people who appears briefly in a story and changes everything. I brought her flowers after the investigation concluded. She told me it wasn't necessary. I told her it absolutely was. I want to say something to anyone listening who recognizes this story from their own life. Not the specifics. Your story won't look exactly like mine because these things never do. But the shape of it. The feeling of being managed out so carefully you can barely point to what's happening. The performance reviews that describe a version of you that you don't recognize. The colleagues who seem to have received a memo about you that you were never included on. The creeping certainty that the person above you has already decided how your story ends, and the terror that they might be right. They might have more power than you. They might have the ear of people above them. They might have spent months building a version of events in which you are the problem, and they are simply, regretfully, trying to address it. And they might be very, very good at it. But here's what Dana forgot. Here's what I want you to remember. People who operate the way she operated almost always do it alone. Not literally. They have their circles, their Beccas, and their Loris, their carefully cultivated alliances. But the actual mechanics of it, The real scheming, the planning and coordinating and strategizing, they do that in corners, in whispers, in emails they think no one will see, because they know, on some level, that what they're doing doesn't survive the light. It only works in the dark. And the dark, as it turns out, is not as permanent as they need it to be. Dana thought nobody would believe me. She had worked hard to make sure of it. She had spoken to the right people, framed the right narrative, gotten Marcus aligned, kept Shauna quiet with threats she had no intention of following through on. She had been meticulous. She had been thorough. She had covered almost every angle. Almost. She didn't cover the paper trail, because she was so confident in her own invincibility that she didn't think she needed to. She left 17 emails sitting in a company server, and when the right person was finally authorized to look, everything she had built her story on collapsed in a single afternoon. I have her termination date saved in my phone. Not to celebrate it, not exactly. Just to remind myself, on days when things feel heavy and progress feels slow and the world feels like it rewards the wrong people, that sometimes, not always, not easily, not without cost, but sometimes the right thing happens anyway. She thought nobody would believe me. She was wrong.